Hi all, my name's Ellie Sutherland and I'm one of the external crew for Theory of Youth. Today I'm presenting the primer for week 6, Language as a Meeting Place. The philosophers that are featuring this week are Jürgen Habermas and Paul Ricoeur, and this week we also have 2 readings, one from Locke and Strong, which focuses on hermeneutics and the part that Ricoeur and Habermas had to play or contribute to it, and a second reading from Keller, which focuses on discourse research and analysis. To begin today, I thought I'd start with a quote from Fry that I found in the Locke and Strong reading. I actually pinched it. It tickled my fancy because it's pretty much describing how I feel at present, and how I gather from some of the posts in the forum is also how some of you feel. In ordinary experience, we're all in the position of a dog in a library, surrounded by a world of meaning in plain sight that we don't even know is there. And I'm just going to let that sit for a little bit and then we'll move on to Jürgen Habermas. Habermas was born on the 18th of June 1929 just outside of Dusseldorf in Germany. I think he's one of the few guys we're studying that's still alive, or at least he doesn't have his death date listed yet, so if he's died then we haven't caught up with it. According to the incredibly reputable source of Wikipedia, Habermas was born with a cleft palate, which gave him difficulties in speaking to and making friends, and this influenced the way that he thought about communication, and the way about communication was also different from his peers. I thought I'd mention this even though I couldn't find it mentioned in a more reputable source, basically because it's relevant to discourse analysis, particularly from a youth perspective, because it's something that seems to come up frequently in discourse of minorities. They tend to see language differently from dominant culture, and a classic example of this is the Adam Goodes incident and the debate that occurred over whether or not he overreacted. Wikipedia also mentions that his father was a Nazi sympathiser, and as a teenager he served in the Hitler Youth. I've mentioned this because the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states that he was profoundly affected by the Nuremberg trials because they brought home the depth of Germany's moral and political failure under Nazi socialism, and he also wasn't impressed by the fact that the culture in German philosophy meant that intellectuals were unable to either understand or criticise National Socialism, and that's something that he actually called Heidegger out for. But the perceived failure that Habermas saw caused him to look overseas to Anglo-American thought, in particular pragmatic and democratic positions. It's probably one of the reasons why he's recognised as one of the most influential philosophers, because he himself has a broad base of influence from Western and European sources. I wonder if it's also one of the reasons why some of his theory is a little more idealistic as opposed to realistic. Some of his theory relies on everybody having an equal voice in discourse, which we all know doesn't very often occur in minorities, and you can see that quite often in the voice that youth or ethnic minorities have got in society. Just one random fact before we move on to the serious stuff. In 2010, Habermas was the victim of an internet hoax. Somebody opened a Twitter account in his name and started sending tweets. Some of those tweets were taken from I think it was a footnote in one of his books. So it got the philosophical community all excited that he joined up with Twitter, but it actually annoyed him a bit. So Habermas must have spoken to Twitter and closed down the account. So looking at Habermas's ongoing research, he seems to have two main fields of interest. The first of those being the political domain, and the second being the area of rationality, communication, and knowledge. Just reading through his biography, as Josh would put it, like a mongrel, he seems to have written heaps of stuff, but has 5 mature positions. Most of those we aren't really all that interested in, but his field of knowledge and interest touches on the political, the sociological, developmental psychology, philosophy, theology, and communication studies. And we're most interested in where he touches on communication studies, and in particular, the readings today are about hermeneutics. So when I first saw the word hermeneutics at the top of the Lock and Strong reading, I thought, oh no, another big word that I don't really know the meaning of, so I looked it up. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary describes hermeneutics as study of the methodological principles of interpretation, as in the Bible, or the method or principle of interpretation. And according to Lock and Strong, hermeneutics is all about meaning. So looking at the Lock and Strong reading, in their discussion of meaning there are several points that jumped out at me. The first one is that meaning can evoke either agreement or contention. So you can either agree on what something means or fight about it. Meaning is generally agreed to be a sense of correctly drawing from common knowledge or from one's idiosyncratic notions. So both the communicator and the receiver have to have a sense of understanding what's being said for there to be meaning. And lastly, hermeneutic scholars identify more than one diverse way of both interpreting and understanding experience. So when you're looking at drawing out meaning, there's more than one way to do it. Okay, so taken from Locke and Strong, Paul Ricoeur has several ideas within his theories that I believe are worth noting. The first of those is that we use language and symbols or words to both derive meaning from and also to change existing understanding through communication. But the meaning contained in these symbols or language isn't static, it changes through history and culture. The second idea is that systems of thought is always partial, and my understanding of that is that when we throw something out there in conversation, the ensuing dialogue combines with our existing understanding to create new understanding, and that the final result is synthetic. It can't be predicted at the beginning of the dialogue. And finally, Ricoeur believed that hermeneutics is the process of trying to understand what earlier thinkers believed through the maze of history and evident language. So the implications of that for us as youth workers are when we look into youth dialogue, it's important to take into account the backstory or the historical position, because that's contributed to the debate and that's where the understanding has come from. And the second thing that we need to understand is that when we enter the dialogue, we need to be conscious of the fact that that dialogue is relational, and also that not everyone is inclined to try and see from somebody else's viewpoint. So while what we say is subjective and what we believe, it's also relational because it's received by clients, other stakeholders, and media. So out of that, the $24,000 question for me is, how do we enter the debate without putting our foot in our mouth and causing damage, especially given the already ambiguous image of... Okay. Habermas's ideas are somewhat idealistic. but I sort of like them because he was motivated by the desire to improve both the justness and the rationality that's possible through cultural discourse. And I think there's room for both of those in the current discourse that exists about youth today. Habermas believes that democratic communication develops norms of ethical communication and assists cross-cultural understanding and ability to relate to each other. And it also increases our appreciation and understanding of differing points of view. Habermas believes that how we communicate influence what results come from our communication. And I think that that's something that we need to be particularly aware of as youth workers because it will have significant impact on our clients and their outcomes. The main problem with his theory of communication is that one of the rules he sets out for democratic debate is that everyone has an equal voice, and that's idealistic rather than realistic. But the challenge, or the $24,000 questions for us as youth workers, is how we can be advocates for that voice for our clients, or how we can be that voice without also being the ones that squash or silence their voice, and also, probably more importantly, how we can assist our clients to find their voice so that they can be heard in the ongoing debate. And one of the things I've discovered is that sometimes young people are reluctant to talk, basically because they don't think that there's much point and nobody will listen. So that, I think, is when it's important that we become their advocates. And before I wrap up, I'll just throw in a brief word on the Keller reading, which I found a bit confusing, possibly because the readings don't give enough around the bits we were supposed to read for me to be able to context. But from what I can gather from what I read in the Keller reading, Habermas is primarily concerned with ethics of discourse, while Rucoa is all about discourse analysis. So that's it from me today. Enjoy the rest of the lecture and the readings, and I'll catch you all on the forums.